They whispered behind my back at my own father's funeral, calling me the family failure who wasted her life playing nursemaid. My brother David smirked as he told mourners I'd probably end up homeless now that Dad was gone. My sister Rachel actually laughed when someone suggested I'd been a devoted daughter. What none of them knew was that while they were busy building their perfect lives and ignoring our father, he was quietly building something that would change everything. This is the story of how the daughter they called worthless became the one person they'd all have to answer to. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Sarah Mitchell, and for 45 years, I've been the invisible daughter in a family that valued success over sacrifice, status over service. While my older brother David built his construction empire and my younger sister Rachel climbed the social ladder through marriage, I chose a different path. I became the keeper of our family's heart, the one who remembered birthdays, visited during holidays, and eventually became the full-time caregiver to our aging father. 5 years ago, when Dad started showing signs of confusion and his doctor mentioned memory issues, I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I gave up my apartment in downtown Philadelphia, left my position as head librarian at the Oakwood Public Library, and moved back into the house on Maple Street where I'd grown up. The same house where David and Rachel had rushed to escape as soon as they turned 18, never looking back except when they needed something. Dad was only 73 then, still sharp most days, still insisting he could manage on his own. But I saw the signs they missed during their brief obligatory visits. The unopened mail piling up on his kitchen table. The way he'd started, wearing the same shirt 3 days in a row. The confusion in his eyes when he couldn't remember where he'd put his reading glasses, which were usually sitting right on top of his head. These weren't just signs of normal aging. These were cries for help that only I seemed to hear. Robert Mitchell had spent 38 years working for the Postal Service, walking the same routes through Oakwood's tree-lined neighborhoods, rain or shine, snow or heat. He was the kind of man who knew every dog's name on his route, who would carry Mrs. Peterson's groceries to her door without being asked, who never missed a day of work in 4 decades of service. Dad believed in consistency, in showing up, in doing what needed to be done without fanfare or recognition. Perhaps that's why he understood when I made the same choice about caring for him. The transition wasn't easy. I'd spent 15 years building my career, earning my master's degree in library science, creating programs that brought literacy to underserved communities. I had plans, dreams, a life that was finally my own after years of being overshadowed by my siblings' more glamorous achievements. But when I looked at Dad sitting alone at his kitchen table, trying to figure out which bills to pay first, I knew there was only one choice I could live with. David's reaction to my decision was predictably practical and utterly heartless. During one of his monthly duty calls, he pulled me aside in Dad's living room, speaking in the hushed tones people use when discussing unpleasant necessities. "Sarah, this is ridiculous," he said, gesturing around the modest room with its worn furniture and faded family photos. "You're throwing your life away. Dad's got good insurance. We can find him a nice place, somewhere with professionals who know what they're doing. You don't have to sacrifice your career for this." The "this" he referred to was our father, the Ray, man who had worked double shifts to pay for David's college tuition, who had driven through a blizzard to bail David out when he got arrested for underage drinking, who had co-signed the loan for David's first work truck when no bank would take, a chance on a 22-year-old with big dreams and no credit history. Rachel's response was even more cutting, delivered during what she called a family meeting at her sprawling home in the affluent Chestnut Hill neighborhood. She'd married well, very well, to a man whose family had owned textile mills for 3 generations. Their house was a monument to inherited wealth, all marble countertops and Persian rugs, with a circular driveway that seemed designed to intimidate visitors. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension she'd perfected since marrying into money. "You need to think about your future. You're not getting any younger, and you don't have a husband or children to take care of you when you're older. What happens when dad's gone and you have nothing? No career, no savings, no prospects?" She was sitting in her pristine kitchen, sipping coffee from China that probably cost more than my monthly salary, wearing jewelry that caught the light every time she gestured. Her life was a carefully curated display of success, and my choice to care for Dad didn't fit the narrative she'd created about the Mitchell family's upward trajectory. "Besides," she continued, "it's not like Dad really needs round-the-clock care yet. You're being overly dramatic. He's just getting older, like everyone does. You're making this into some kind of crisis when it's perfectly normal." But they weren't there at 3 a.m. when Dad woke up confused and scared, calling for his own mother who'd been dead for 20 years. They didn't see him standing in the kitchen in his pajamas, trying to make coffee with laundry detergent, because he couldn't remember which container held what. They didn't witness the moments of heartbreaking clarity when he'd realize he was losing himself piece by piece and would apologize for being a burden, as if needing care was something shameful. Those moments taught me something my siblings never learned: that taking care of someone you love isn't a sacrifice, it's a privilege. Every morning when I helped Dad with his medications, every evening when we sat together watching his favorite westerns, every doctor's appointment where I held his hand and asked the questions he was too proud to voice, I was storing up memories that would comfort me long after he was gone. The truth was, those 5 years weren't just about caring for Dad. They were about getting to know him in a way I never had before, without the distractions of work and social obligations, without the pressure to be anywhere else. I discovered that my father was a far more complex and interesting man than any of us had ever realized. Dad had opinions about everything, from local politics to the books he'd started reading since retirement. He told me stories about his childhood during the Depression, about meeting my mother at a church dance, about the dreams he'd put aside to provide for his family. He shared his regrets too, the biggest one being that he'd worked so much when we were young that he'd missed too many school plays and soccer games, and ordinary moments that couldn't be reclaimed. I thought providing was the same as loving. He told me one evening as we sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. "I thought if I worked hard enough, made enough money, gave you kids what I never had, that would be enough. But love isn't just paying bills, Sarah. Love is showing up. Love is being present. You're the only one who learned that lesson." Those words hit me harder than any criticism my siblings had ever leveled. Dad saw what they couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge, that my choice to stay wasn't about having nothing better to do, but about understanding what really mattered. While David was building his business empire and Rachel was climbing social ladders, I was building something more valuable and more lasting. I was building a relationship based on presence, on attention, on the radical act of putting someone else's needs before your own ambitions. The progression of Dad's condition was gradual but relentless. What started as occasional confusion became daily struggles with memory and reasoning. Simple tasks like dressing or preparing meals became mountain climbs that required patience and creativity to navigate. There were good days when Dad was almost his old self, cracking jokes and offering advice about my non-existent love life. There were harder days when he didn't recognize me at first, when I had to reintroduce myself as his daughter and earn his trust all over again. Through it all, David and Rachel maintained their distance, dropping by for brief visits that felt more like inspections than family time. They'd stay just long enough to ask if Dad needed anything, to comment on how well I was managing, and to remind me that their offer to find him professional care still stood. They never stayed for meals, never helped with the daily routines that had become our rhythm, never offered to sit with Dad so I could have a few hours to myself. Their absence spoke volumes about their priorities, but it also revealed something about Dad that surprised me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Despite their neglect, despite their obvious discomfort with his declining health, he never spoke ill of them in my presence. When David would call to cancel a planned visit because of work obligations, Dad would simply nod and say he understood how busy important people get. When Rachel would cut her visits short because her children had activities or her husband had social commitments, Dad would smile and tell her family came first. But I began to notice other things during those years. Dad had always been private about his finances, managing his own accounts and investments with the meticulous attention he'd brought to his postal route. He'd never been flashy with money, driving the same pickup truck for 15 years, shopping at discount stores, clipping coupons like they were precious documents. Yet he never seemed to worry about medical bills or household expenses. Never. Suggested that my staying to care for him was creating a financial burden. When I'd try to contribute to household expenses from my small savings, he'd wave me off with a gentle stubbornness that brooked no argument. "You're giving me something more valuable than money," he'd say. "You're giving me your life, your time, your youth. The least I can do is keep a roof over our heads and food on our table." I assumed this confidence came from his postal pension and Social Security, maybe some modest savings from decades of careful living. Dad had always been responsible with money, the kind of man who paid his bills early and avoided debt like it was contagious. It never occurred to me to question where his sense of financial security originated, or to wonder why a retired postal worker could afford to support 2 adults without apparent strain. As Dad's condition worsened, the visits from David and Rachel became even more perfunctory and uncomfortable. They seemed increasingly eager to escape the reality of his decline, as if witnessing his vulnerability might somehow diminish their own sense of invincibility. Their conversations with him became stilted and awkward, filled with the kind of forced cheerfulness people use when they're uncomfortable with authentic emotion. David would talk about his business, his latest construction projects, his plans to expand into commercial development. He'd speak to Dad like he was delivering a quarterly report to shareholders, focusing on numbers and achievements while carefully avoiding anything that required genuine connection or vulnerability. When Dad would try to ask about David's family, about his wife Lisa or their twin boys, David's answers would be brief and superficial, as if sharing real details about his personal life was somehow beneath him. Rachel's visits were performances of a different kind. She'd arrive dressed like she was attending a charity luncheon, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her jewelry carefully chosen to suggest wealth without appearing ostentatious. She'd perch on the edge of Dad's favorite armchair, like she was afraid of catching something, speaking in the bright, artificial tone people use with children or invalids. "You look wonderful, Daddy," she'd chirp, even when Dad was having a particularly difficult day. "You're so lucky to have Sarah here to take care of you. I don't know how she does it. I could never be so patient." The backhanded compliments were Rachel's specialty. She'd praise my caregiving while simultaneously suggesting it was somehow unnatural, that my ability to handle Dad's needs came from a lack of other options rather than from love or choice. She'd marvel at my patience, as if caring for our father required superhuman endurance rather than basic human decency. But the most telling moments came when Dad would have episodes of confusion or distress in their presence. Instead of offering comfort or assistance, they'd look to me to handle the situation, stepping back like spectators at an unpleasant theater performance. They wanted the benefits of having Dad cared for without having to confront the messy, difficult realities that care involved. During the last year of Dad's life, his condition deteriorated significantly. The man who had once prided himself on his independence now needed help with almost every aspect of daily living. There were days when he didn't recognize me, when he'd call for his wife who died 10 years earlier, when he'd become agitated and frightened by his own confusion. These were the hardest days, the ones that tested every reserve of patience and strength I possessed. It was during this period that David and Rachel began their campaign to convince me that Dad needed professional care. They'd arrive for their brief visits armed with brochures for assisted living facilities, statistics about the benefits of memory care units, and thinly veiled suggestions that I was in over my head. "Sarah, you're burning yourself out," David would say, watching me help Dad with his lunch. "This isn't sustainable. Dad needs more than you can give him at home. These places have trained staff, medical support, activities designed for people with his condition." The subtext was clear. I was failing, and my failure was becoming an embarrassment to the family. They wanted Dad safely contained somewhere. They could visit occasionally without having to witness the daily realities of his decline. They wanted him managed by professionals so they could return to their lives without the guilt of knowing their father was struggling while they pursued their own interests. Rachel was even more direct in her criticism. "Sarah, this is becoming ridiculous. You look exhausted. You've gained weight. You never go anywhere or do anything fun. You're wasting your life playing nurse to someone who doesn't even remember who you are half the time. What's the point?" Her words cut deep because they contained just enough truth to sting. I was exhausted. I had gained weight from stress eating and lack of exercise. I rarely left the house except for Dad's medical appointments and grocery runs. My social life had shrunk to occasional phone calls with old colleagues and brief conversations with neighbors. From the outside, my life probably did look like a waste, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unlimited self-sacrifice. But Rachel couldn't see what I saw every day. She couldn't see the moment when Dad's face would light up with recognition, when he'd remember my name and squeeze my hand like I was his lifeline to the world. She couldn't see how he'd relax when I'd read to him from his favorite books, or how he'd hum along when I'd play the old country songs he loved. She couldn't see that even in his confusion, he knew he was safe, that someone who loved him was nearby and watching over him. Most importantly, she couldn't see the man Dad still was beneath the disease that was stealing his memories. Yes, there were days when he didn't recognize me, but there were still moments of connection, flashes of humor and wisdom and love that made every difficult day worthwhile. Taking care of him wasn't just about managing his physical needs. It was about preserving his dignity, honoring the person he'd been, and ensuring that his final chapter was written with compassion rather than convenience. The pressure from my siblings intensified as Dad's condition worsened. They began staging what amounted to interventions, arriving together with printed materials about various facilities, financial projections showing the cost of professional care versus the value of my time, and increasingly urgent arguments about why continuing to care for Dad at home was selfish and irresponsible. "You're not doing him any favors," David argued during one particularly tense confrontation. "He needs stimulation, social interaction, medical supervision. You're isolating him here, keeping him from getting the help he really needs." It was a masterful manipulation, framing their desire to institutionalize Dad as concern for his welfare rather than acknowledgement of their own discomfort and impatience. They wanted to transform their abandonment into advocacy, their convenience into compassion. The morning I lost my father started like any other Tuesday. Dad had been having more bad days than good ones lately, but that particular morning brought one of those precious moments of clarity that had become increasingly rare. He woke up knowing exactly who I was, where he was, and what day it was. We shared breakfast together at the kitchen table where he'd eaten thousands of meals over the decades, and he even managed a few bites of the scrambled eggs I'd learned to make exactly the way he liked them, with just a touch of cream and black pepper. "Sarah, honey," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "I want you to know something important. Whatever happens to me, you've given me the greatest gift any father could ask for. You've given me your presence, your love, your life. That means more to me than all the money in the world." I squeezed his hand across the table, fighting back tears. "Dad, you don't need to thank me. This is what families do. We take care of each other." He shook his head slowly, his eyes more focused than they'd been in months. "No, sweetheart. This is what you do. This is who you are. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small for having such a big heart." Those were the last coherent words my father ever spoke to me. By that afternoon, he'd slipped into unconsciousness, his breathing becoming labored and shallow. I called David and Rachel immediately, but David was in the middle of an important client meeting and couldn't come until evening. Rachel was at her country club's charity auction and said she'd stop by when it was convenient. Dad died at 11:30 that night, with only me holding his hand. The hospice nurse who'd been helping us during those final weeks said he looked peaceful, that he'd simply let go when he was ready. I sat with him until dawn, talking to him about all the memories we'd shared, all the ways he'd shaped my life, all the love that would continue even though he was gone. When I finally called my siblings to tell them Dad had passed, their responses revealed everything I needed to know about their priorities. David's first question was about funeral arrangements and costs. Rachel's first concern was whether the death would interfere with her planned vacation to Martha's Vineyard the following week. "Well, at least he's not suffering anymore," Rachel said, her tone suggesting relief rather than grief. "And honestly, Sarah, now you can finally get your life back. You're still young enough to start over, find a career, maybe even meet someone." The casual dismissal of 5 years of my life, of the profound relationship I'd built with our father, left me speechless. To Rachel, those years represented nothing more than time wasted, a detour from the life she thought I should have been living. She couldn't conceive that caring for Dad had been meaningful, purposeful, or fulfilling in any way. David was more practical, but equally insensitive. "We'll need to move quickly on clearing out the house," he said during our first family meeting, after Dad's death. "The funeral costs are going to be significant, and we'll want to get the property on the market as soon as possible. The real estate market is hot right now, and we don't want to miss the opportunity." I stared at him across Dad's dining room table, the same table where we'd eaten countless family meals, where I'd helped Dad with his medications every morning, where he'd told me stories about his childhood and shared his hopes for my future. To David, it was just inventory to be liquidated, square footage to be monetized. "David, Dad just died 3 days ago," I said quietly. "Don't you think we should focus on honoring his memory before we start talking about selling his home?" David's expression hardened with impatience. "Sarah, grief is a luxury we can't afford right now. Dad lived paycheck to paycheck his whole life. Do you have any idea what this funeral is going to cost? What the medical bills from his final months are going to add up to? We need to be practical about this." But I knew something David didn't know, something Dad had shared with me during one of his lucid moments several months earlier. He'd told me not to worry about money, that he'd made sure everything was taken care of. When I'd pressed him for details, he'd just smiled and said I'd understand everything when the time came. At the time, I'd assumed he was confused, mixing up dreams with reality the way he sometimes did. Now I wondered if there had been more clarity in his words than I'd realized. The funeral planning process became a nightmare of competing egos and conflicting priorities. David wanted everything done as cheaply as possible, suggesting we skip the viewing and opt for a simple graveside service. Rachel wanted something that would reflect well on the family's social standing, pushing for an elaborate ceremony at the most prestigious funeral home in town. "People will be watching," Rachel insisted, applying lipstick in the mirror of the funeral home's family consultation room. "Dad worked in this community for almost 40 years. There will be expectations about how we handle this. We can't look like we're cutting corners." The irony was staggering. Rachel, who had visited Dad perhaps 6 times in the past 5 years, was now concerned about appearances and community expectations. David, who had repeatedly suggested that Dad's final care was too expensive and complicated, was now worried about funeral costs. Neither of them seemed remotely interested in what Dad would have actually wanted. I found myself caught between their conflicting demands, trying to plan a service that would honor Dad's memory while managing their competing agendas. The funeral director, a kind man named Mr. Roberts who had known Dad from his postal route, quietly suggested that we focus on what would best reflect the man we were remembering, rather than what would satisfy external expectations. The morning of the funeral, I woke up in Dad's house feeling utterly alone despite being surrounded by arriving relatives and family friends. I'd chosen to wear a simple black dress that Dad had always complimented, along with the pearl necklace he'd given me for my college graduation. The house was filled with flowers and casseroles from neighbors who remembered Dad's kindness, people whose lives he'd touched through decades of faithful service. David arrived an hour before the service wearing an expensive black suit and the kind of somber expression he probably practiced in the mirror. He moved through the house like he was inspecting a property, making mental notes about repairs that would need to be made before listing it for sale. When Mrs. Henderson, our elderly neighbor, tried to share a memory about Dad's helpfulness during last winter's snowstorm, David nodded politely but kept checking his phone. Rachel made her entrance like she was arriving at a premiere, dressed in designer black with jewelry that caught the light every time she moved. She'd brought her husband Michael and their 2 teenage children, who looked supremely uncomfortable at being forced to attend their grandfather's funeral. The kids had barely known Dad, thanks to Rachel's careful management of their exposure to what she considered the less sophisticated side of the family. The service at St. Mary's Presbyterian was beautiful in its simplicity. Pastor Williams, who had known Dad for 20 years, spoke eloquently about his character, his dedication to family and community, his quiet faith that had sustained him through life's challenges. The church was packed with people Dad had touched through his work and his presence in the community, postal workers and neighbors and shopkeepers who remembered his smile and his reliability. During the eulogy, I watched my siblings' faces and saw nothing but polite attention, the kind of respectful but distant expression people wear at the funerals of acquaintances rather than beloved family members. When Pastor Williams invited family members to share memories, David declined with a shake of his head, and Rachel whispered something about being too emotional to speak publicly. I stood up and walked to the podium, looking out at a church filled with people who had genuinely loved my father. I spoke about his kindness, his work ethic, his devotion to family, and his quiet wisdom. I shared stories about his care for others, his sense of humor, and his belief that showing up was the most important thing you could do for the people you loved. When I finished, the applause was genuine and sustained, and I saw tears in the eyes of people who had known Dad as I had known him. The graveside service was smaller, but no less meaningful. As we stood around the gravesite at Riverside Cemetery, listening to Pastor Williams's final prayers, I felt the weight of finality settling over me. Dad was really gone, and with him went the anchor that had given my life meaning and purpose for the past 5 years. It was during the drive back to the church for the reception that the real ugliness began to emerge. David, Rachel, and I rode together in the funeral home's limousine, and the moment we were alone, their masks began to slip. "Well, that was nicely done," Rachel said, checking her makeup in a compact mirror. Pastor Williams certainly knew how to make Dad sound more important than he actually was. All that talk about community service and dedication, you'd think he was running for mayor instead of delivering mail. David snorted with amusement. "The man walked the same route for 38 years. Let's not make it sound like he was changing the world. He did his job, collected his paycheck, and went home. Nothing wrong with that, but let's keep things in perspective." Their casual dismissal of Dad's life and legacy hit me like a physical blow. Here was the truth I'd been trying to avoid. My siblings had never respected our father, had never valued the qualities that made him special, had never understood why his simple, honest life was worth celebrating. "He was a good man," I said, quietly, my voice tight with controlled emotion. "He worked hard, he loved his family, he made a difference in people's lives. That should count for something." Rachel turned to look at me with barely concealed pity. "Sarah, honey, you spent 5 years taking care of him. Of course you're going to romanticize his life." But the reality is that Dad never accomplished anything significant. He never built a business like David, never married well like I did, never created anything lasting. He was just ordinary. The word hit me like a slap. Ordinary. As if kindness was ordinary. As if loyalty was commonplace. As if the daily choice to show up and care for others was something anyone could do without effort or sacrifice. There's nothing wrong with being ordinary, I replied, but my voice lacked conviction, even to my own ears. David leaned forward, his tone taking on the patronizing quality he used when explaining business concepts to people he considered less sophisticated. Sarah, what Rachel is trying to say is that you've put your life on hold for someone who, frankly, would have been fine in professional care. You gave up your career, your social life, your chances for marriage and children, for what? So Dad could die at home instead of in a nice facility? The limousine pulled up to the church, but none of us moved to get out. This conversation had been building for 5 years, and now, with Dad safely buried, my siblings finally felt free to express their true feelings. You're 45 years old, Rachel continued, her voice taking on the tone she used when explaining obvious facts to slow children. You have no husband, no children, no career prospects, no savings. You've essentially thrown away the best years of your life. For what? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. For what, indeed? What did I have to show for 5 years of devotion, sacrifice, and love? What tangible accomplishments could I point to that would satisfy their definition of a life well lived? I have the knowledge that I did the right thing, I said finally. I have the memories of time spent with someone I loved. I have the peace of knowing Dad didn't die alone and scared in some institutional setting. David shook his head with the kind of frustrated disappointment parents show children who refuse to learn obvious lessons. Sarah, that's beautiful in theory, but what are you going to do now? You can't live on warm feelings and good intentions. You need a plan, a future, something concrete. Before I could respond, Rachel delivered the blow that would define our relationship forever. The truth is, Sarah, you used Dad as an excuse to avoid building a real life. You hid behind caregiving because it was easier than facing the fact that you're not very good at the things that matter in the real world. You're not ambitious like David. You're not socially skilled like me. You're not particularly attractive, or charming, or successful. Taking care of Dad gave you a purpose you never would have found otherwise. The words hit me with surgical precision, cutting through every defense I'd built around my choices. In Rachel's view, my 5 years of sacrifice weren't noble or loving, they were pathetic. I hadn't chosen caregiving out of devotion. I'd stumbled into it out of inadequacy. That's not true, I whispered. But even as I said it, I felt the seeds of doubt taking root. Had I really chosen this life out of love? Or had it chosen me because I lacked the courage and capability to build something else? David sensed my vulnerability and pressed his advantage. Look, Sarah, we're not trying to be cruel. We're trying to help you face reality. You're starting over at 45 with nothing. No career, no relationships, no financial security. The house we'll need to be sold to cover Dad's debts and funeral expenses. What's your plan? The mention of Dad's debts confused me. From everything I'd observed, Dad had been financially comfortable throughout his final years. His bills were always paid, his modest needs were met, and he'd never expressed concern about money. But David spoke with such certainty that I began to question my own observations. What debts? I asked. Rachel and David exchanged a look that suggested I was being naive about obvious realities. Sarah, Dad lived on a postal pension and Social Security, Rachel explained with exaggerated patience. Do you have any idea how much his medical care cost over the past few years? The medications, the doctor visits, the hospital stays? Not to mention the household expenses of supporting 2 adults on a fixed income. But he never seemed worried about money, I protested. He always said everything was taken care of. David's laugh was harsh and dismissive. Dad had his pride, Sarah. He wasn't going to admit to his daughter that he was drowning financially, but the numbers don't lie. We're going to be lucky if selling the house covers what he owed. The implications of David's words began to sink in. If Dad had died with significant debts, if the house sale would barely cover his obligations, then I truly would be starting over with nothing. 5 years of my life, and I'd end up financially worse off than when I'd started. Of course, we'll help you get back on your feet, Rachel said, her tone suggesting this was a generous offer rather than a basic family obligation. Michael knows people in the city who might be able to find you something entry-level. It won't be glamorous, but at your age and with your work history, you can't be too picky. Entry-level, at 45. After 15 years as a head librarian and 5 years managing the complex medical and emotional needs of a declining parent. The phrase hung in the air like a judgment on everything I'd accomplished and everything I'd sacrificed. The reception at the church fellowship hall was a blur of condolences and casseroles. Well-meaning neighbors sharing memories of Dad's kindness while my siblings worked the room like politicians at a campaign event. I watched David network with local business owners, turning conversations about Dad into opportunities to discuss his construction projects. I observed Rachel charming the wives of prominent community members, positioning herself as the successful daughter who had transcended her modest origins. Throughout the afternoon, I overheard fragments of conversations that revealed how differently people perceived our family dynamics. To the community members who had known Dad well, I was the devoted daughter who had sacrificed everything to care for her father. To my siblings' social circles, I was apparently the spinster sister who had never managed to build a life of her own. Mrs. Henderson, who had been Dad's neighbor for over 20 years, pulled me aside during the reception to share her perspective. "Your father was so proud of you, dear," she said, her wrinkled hand squeezing mine with surprising strength. "He used to tell me how grateful he was that you'd given up everything to take care of him. He said you were the only one of his children who understood what really mattered in life." Her words brought tears to my eyes, but they also highlighted the growing distance between my reality and my siblings' interpretation of it. Dad had been grateful for my care, had valued my presence, had found meaning in our shared time together. But David and Rachel saw only wasted years and missed opportunities. As the reception wound down and people began to leave, my siblings cornered me in the church kitchen where I was helping to clean up. The space felt confining and institutional. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while I dried dishes and tried to process the magnitude of my loss. "Sarah, we need to talk about practical matters," David said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in business meetings. "The house needs to be cleared out and prepared for sale as quickly as possible. I've already contacted a realtor who specializes in estate sales. She thinks we can have it on the market within 2 weeks if we move fast." 2 weeks. 45 years of family memories, 5 years of caregiving, a lifetime of accumulated possessions and photographs and mementos, reduced to a 2-week clearance timeline. "That seems awfully fast," I said, hanging up the dish towel with hands that trembled slightly. "Don't you think we should take some time to go through Dad's things, to preserve what's meaningful?" Rachel's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Sarah, it's a house full of old furniture and outdated electronics. What exactly do you think we're going to find that's worth preserving? Dad wasn't exactly a collector of priceless antiques." The casual dismissal of Dad's possessions felt like another dismissal of his life and legacy. Every piece of furniture had a story, every photograph captured a memory, every book and tool and kitchen gadget represented a choice Dad had made about how to live his life. To Rachel, they were just obstacles to a quick sale. Besides, David D. added, "You're going to need to find a place to live. The sooner we can close on the house, the sooner you can take your share of the proceeds and get settled somewhere new. Probably an apartment in the city where the job prospects are better." My share of the proceeds. The phrase implied that I had some claim on the house where I'd lived for 5 years, where I'd devoted my adult life to caring for our father. But did I have any legal right to the property? Dad had never discussed his will with me, had never spelled out his intentions for the distribution of his assets. Has anyone contacted Dad's lawyer about the will? I asked, the question emerging more tentatively than I'd intended. David and Rachel exchanged another one of their meaningful looks, the kind of silent communication that had always made me feel like an outsider in my own family. Actually, Sarah, we need to discuss that, Rachel said, her tone becoming carefully neutral. Dad's lawyer, Linda Chen, contacted us yesterday. Apparently, Dad did have a will, and it's more complicated than we expected. The word complicated sent a chill through me. In my experience, legal complications usually meant someone was about to be disappointed or excluded. What kind of complications? I asked. David cleared his throat, the way he did when preparing to deliver unwelcome news. Well, it turns out Dad left specific instructions about the distribution of his assets. The will reading is scheduled for next Tuesday at Linda Chen's office. We'll all need to be there. Something in David's tone suggested that this will reading was going to be more significant than a simple division of modest assets. But before I could ask for more details, Rachel quickly changed the subject. The important thing right now is getting the house ready for sale, she said briskly. We can deal with the legal details next week. In the meantime, you should start packing your personal belongings and deciding what you want to keep. The assumption that I would be leaving Dad's house, that my 5 years of residence there had been temporary and conditional, stung more than I'd expected. This had been my home, the place where I'd built the most meaningful relationship of my adult life, where I'd learned what it meant to love someone without expecting anything in return. I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. David's patience was clearly wearing thin. Sarah, you can't live in the house indefinitely. It needs to be sold. Even if Dad left it to all 3 of us equally, which is unlikely given his financial situation, you couldn't afford to buy out our shares or maintain the property on your own. The casual certainty with which David dismissed my options revealed how little he understood about my relationship with Dad or my knowledge of his affairs. He assumed that because I had been a caregiver rather than a breadwinner, I must be financially helpless and legally powerless. But Dad's words from our final coherent conversation echoed in my memory. Whatever happens to me, you've given me the greatest gift any father could ask for. At the time, I'd interpreted those words as gratitude and affection. Now I wondered if they contained a deeper meaning, a hint about provisions he'd made for my future. As we finished cleaning up the church kitchen and prepared to leave, I found myself looking forward to the will reading with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Maybe Dad had found a way to ensure that my years of sacrifice wouldn't leave me destitute and homeless. Maybe his quiet confidence about financial matters had been based on concrete planning rather than wishful thinking. Or maybe David and Rachel were right, and I was about to discover that my 5 years of devotion had been not just unappreciated, but also financially ruinous. Either way, Tuesday couldn't come soon enough. The week between Dad's funeral and the will reading became a battleground of assumptions and expectations. David and Rachel had apparently decided that my future was theirs to plan, and they approached the task with the same ruthless efficiency they brought to their own professional endeavors. What they didn't anticipate was how their attempts to control my life would reveal the depths of their selfishness and cruelty. It started on Wednesday morning when David arrived at Dad's house with a moving truck and 3-day laborers he'd hired from his construction crew. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee from Dad's favorite mug, and trying to process the reality of my new situation, when I heard vehicles pulling into the driveway. "Sarah, we need to get started on the clean-out," David announced, as he walked through the front door without knocking. "I've got these guys for the whole day, and we need to maximize their time. The realtor wants to do a walkthrough on Friday, so we need everything cleared out by then. I stared at him in disbelief. David? What are you talking about? The will reading isn't until Tuesday. We don't even know what Dad's wishes were for the house. David's expression hardened with impatience. Sarah, let's be realistic. Dad was living paycheck to paycheck. Whatever he left behind, it's not going to be enough to change anyone's situation dramatically. The sooner we get this place ready for sale, the sooner we can all move on with our lives. Behind him, the three workers stood awkwardly in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with being dragged into a family dispute, but contractually obligated to follow David's instructions. They were holding boxes and trash bags, ready to begin dismantling the home where I'd spent the past 5 years of my life. I'm not ready for this, I said, standing up from the table. I need time to go through Dad's belongings properly, to decide what should be saved and what should be donated. You can't just throw everything away like it's garbage. Rachel chose that moment to make her entrance, carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of outfit she'd wear to manage a charity auction. She surveyed the living room with the calculating gaze of someone appraising inventory rather than viewing a family home. "Oh, good, you got started," she said to David before turning to me with barely concealed exasperation. "Sarah, I know this is emotional for you, but we need to be practical. Most of this stuff is worthless anyway. Old furniture, outdated electronics, clothes that smell like mothballs. The longer we wait, the more money we lose in carrying costs." The casual dismissal of Dad's possessions as worthless felt like another blow to his memory. Every piece of furniture had been chosen carefully within his modest budget. Every book had been read and enjoyed. Every photograph captured a moment he'd wanted to preserve. To reduce his entire material legacy to stuff that smells like mothballs revealed how little Rachel had ever understood or valued our father. "These aren't just possessions," I said, my voice rising with emotion. "This is Dad's life. These things meant something to him. They tell the story of who he was and what he cared about." David sighed heavily, like a parent dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "Sarah, sentiment doesn't pay bills. We're looking at thousands of dollars in funeral expenses, medical bills, and estate costs. Every day we delay putting this house on the market is money out of our pockets." But there was something else in David's urgency that didn't quite ring true. If Dad had really died with significant debts, wouldn't there be a formal accounting of those obligations? Wouldn't there be creditors making demands or lawyers explaining our legal responsibilities? Instead, my siblings seemed to be operating on assumptions rather than facts. "Have you actually seen documentation of these debts you keep mentioning?" I asked. Because Dad always seemed financially comfortable to me. He never asked for help with bills or seemed worried about money. Rachel and David exchanged another one of their meaningful looks, and I saw something flicker across their faces that might have been uncertainty or concern. "Sarah, you were focused on caregiving," Rachel said carefully. "You weren't involved in the financial management of the household. Dad probably shielded you from the worst of it because he didn't want to burden you with worries about money." But that explanation didn't match my experience. I'd lived in the house for 5 years, had managed the household expenses and medical appointments, had been present for countless phone calls and mail deliveries. If Dad had been struggling financially, I would have seen evidence of it. The workers were still standing in the doorway, waiting for direction, and David's impatience was becoming more apparent by the minute. "Look, we can sort through sentimental items later," he said. "Right now we need to clear out the obvious stuff. Old magazines, expired medications, broken appliances, things that are clearly trash." Before I could protest, he was directing the workers toward Dad's bedroom, the most private space in the house. I followed them, horrified by the thought of strangers going through Dad's personal belongings without care or respect. "Wait," I called out. "Let me go through his room first." There might be important papers or personal items that need to be handled carefully. David turned to face me with undisguised irritation. Sarah, we don't have time for this level of micromanagement. These guys know what they're doing. They're not going to throw away anything valuable. But as I watched one of the workers begin emptying Dad's dresser drawers into a garbage bag, I realized that their definition of valuable was purely monetary. They were disposing of letters, photographs, and personal mementos without even glancing at their contents. Stop, I said firmly, moving toward the worker. I need to go through those items myself. The worker looked uncertainly between me and David, clearly uncomfortable with the conflicting instructions. David's face flushed with anger at having his authority challenged in front of his employees. Sarah, this is ridiculous, he snapped. You're being overly emotional about a bunch of old papers and knickknacks. We need to be efficient here. That's when Rachel delivered the statement that would forever define our relationship and reveal the true depths of her selfishness. Honestly, Sarah, it's time for you to face reality, she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she used when explaining obvious truths to inferior minds. You've been living in a fantasy world for 5 years, playing house with Dad like you were still a little girl. But Dad is gone now, and it's time for you to grow up and join the real world. The words hit me like a physical blow. Playing house. Like my 5 years of sacrifice, dedication, and love had been nothing more than an elaborate game of make-believe. I wasn't playing house, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of hurt and anger. I was taking care of our father. I was making sure he felt loved and valued during the most difficult period of his life. Rachel's laugh was cold and dismissive. Sarah, you were hiding from life. You used Dad's illness as an excuse to avoid facing your own failures and limitations. But now that excuse is gone, and you need to figure out how to function as an independent adult. The cruelty of her assessment took my breath away. In Rachel's view, my caregiving hadn't been a choice motivated by love and duty. It had been an escape motivated by fear and inadequacy. David sensed my vulnerability and moved in for the kill. Rachel's right, Sarah. You've been living in a bubble for 5 years. No job pressure, no financial responsibilities, no social obligations. But that's over now. You need to find an apartment, get a job, and start supporting yourself like everyone else. The assumption that my life with Dad had been easy, that caregiving was somehow less challenging than their professional obligations, revealed how completely they misunderstood what the past 5 years had entailed. They saw only the absence of traditional markers of success, not the presence of profound responsibility and emotional labor. I had plenty of responsibilities, I protested. Medical appointments, medication management, household maintenance, emotional support. Taking care of someone with declining cognitive abilities is a full-time job that requires constant vigilance and patience. Rachel waved her hand dismissively. That's not the same as real work, Sarah. That's not building a career or contributing to society in a meaningful way. That's just maintenance. Maintenance. Like Dad had been a broken appliance that needed periodic attention rather than a human being deserving of dignity and care. But it was David's next suggestion that pushed their cruelty into truly unconscionable territory. Actually, I've been thinking about Sarah's situation, he said, his tone becoming calculating and businesslike. And I might have a solution that could work for everyone. Rachel raised an eyebrow with interest. What kind of solution? David turned to address me directly, his expression taking on the false sincerity of a salesman making a pitch he knew was questionable. Sarah, you've obviously got experience with elder care now. And frankly, that's a growing field with good job prospects. I happen to know that Michael's mother, Eleanor, is looking for a live-in companion. Rachel's face lit up with enthusiasm at the suggestion. Eleanor Thompson was Michael's 83-year-old mother, a wealthy widow who lived in a mansion in the exclusive Chestnut Hill neighborhood. She was also notoriously demanding, imperious, and difficult to please. "That's a brilliant idea," Rachel exclaimed. "Eleanor pays very well, and the position includes room and board. It would solve all of Sarah's immediate problems." I stared at them in growing horror as I realized what they were suggesting. They wanted me to go directly from caring for my father to caring for a stranger, to transform my years of family devotion into a professional caregiving career. "You want me to become Eleanor's servant," I said slowly, making sure I understood their proposal correctly. "Not a servant," David corrected quickly. "A companion. Someone to help with daily activities, provide transportation, offer social interaction. It's a respected position." But the euphemisms couldn't disguise the reality of what they were proposing. After 5 years of sacrifice for my own family, they wanted me to repeat that sacrifice for someone else's family, to monetize the skills I'd developed through love and turn them into a commercial transaction. "Eleanor is very particular about her needs," Rachel added, apparently oblivious to how her description undermined her own argument about the position being desirable. "She's had trouble keeping companions because she has high standards, but Sarah already knows how to deal with difficult elderly people." Difficult elderly people. Like Dad had been a burden to be endured rather than a father to be cherished. The realization hit me with stunning clarity. My siblings didn't see caregiving as noble or meaningful work. They saw it as something people did when they couldn't succeed at anything else, a last resort for those who lacked the talent or ambition. For real careers, "I'm not interested," I said firmly. "I cared for Dad because I loved him, because he was my father. I'm not looking to turn that experience into a profession." David's face darkened with frustration. "Sarah, you need to be practical here. You're 45 years old with no current job prospects and no recent work experience outside of caregiving. This is a legitimate opportunity to use the skills you've developed." But Rachel was even more direct in her criticism of my reluctance. "Sarah, you're being incredibly ungrateful," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "David and I are trying to help you transition into independence, and you're acting like we're insulting you. Do you have a better plan? Because sitting around feeling sorry for yourself isn't going to pay your rent." The accusation of ingratitude was particularly galling given that they were trying to push me into a position that would primarily benefit them. If I became Eleanor's live-in companion, I wouldn't be their responsibility anymore. My housing, income, and daily supervision would become someone else's problem. "I haven't had time to make plans yet," I said. "Dad died less than a week ago. I'm still processing his loss, and you're already trying to ship me off to work for strangers." David's impatience reached a breaking point. "Sarah, grief is a luxury you can't afford. You need income and housing immediately. Eleanor's position offers both, plus the chance to build a professional reputation in elder care. Why are you being so stubborn about this?" Before I could answer, Rachel delivered the final blow that revealed the true extent of their selfishness and cruelty. "Look, Sarah, let's be completely honest here," she said, her voice taking on the harsh edge of someone who had decided that diplomacy was no longer necessary. "You don't have a lot of options. You're middle-aged, you're unmarried, you have no children, and you've been out of the professional workforce for 5 years. Most employers are going to see you as damaged goods." Damaged goods, like I was defective merchandise that needed to be discounted for quick sale. "You're not exactly management material," she continued relentlessly. "You're not young enough to start over in an entry-level position with growth potential. And you don't have the social connections or professional network to leverage your way into something better." Each word was chosen to cut deep, to strip away any illusions I might have had about my value or prospects. In Rachel's assessment, I was essentially unemployable, except in positions that required no skill, ambition, or potential for advancement. "The elder care position is actually generous considering your limitations," David added, apparently deciding that since Rachel had started being brutally honest, he might as well join in. Eleanor pays $60,000 a year plus room and board. That's probably more than you could make anywhere else given your circumstances. $60,000 a year to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no personal life, no privacy, and no autonomy. It was a generous salary, only if you ignored the complete surrender of independence it required. Besides, Rachel said, warming to her theme, it's not like you have any other family obligations. You don't have a husband who needs you, children who depend on you, or social commitments that would make the live-in arrangement inconvenient. In many ways, you're perfectly suited for this kind of work. The casual dismissal of my potential for having a family or social life of my own was perhaps the most hurtful aspect of their entire argument. They weren't just suggesting that I take a job as a live-in companion, they were suggesting that I accept it as my permanent role in life, that I embrace being alone and isolated as a professional qualification. What if I don't want to spend the rest of my life taking care of other people's elderly relatives? I asked. David shrugged with apparent indifference. Then you better come up with an alternative plan pretty quickly. Because the bills don't stop just because you're having an identity crisis. That's when I realized the full scope of their manipulation. They were manufacturing urgency about my financial situation to pressure me into accepting a solution that primarily benefited them. If I became Eleanor's live-in companion, they wouldn't have to worry about my housing, my income, or my emotional needs. I would be safely contained in someone else's household, earning my own living, no longer their responsibility or concern. The three workers had been standing around awkwardly during this entire conversation, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing a family dispute, but unable to leave without David's permission. Finally, one of them cleared his throat and asked if they should continue with the clean-out. Absolutely, David said, turning away from me with dismissive finality. Sarah, you can take whatever personal items you want, but the furniture and household goods need to go. We're listing this place on Friday, whether you like it or not. As I watched strangers begin dismantling the home where I'd spent the most meaningful years of my adult life, I felt something shift inside me. The grief and confusion that had dominated my emotions since Dad's death began to crystallize into something harder and more focused. Anger. Not just anger at my siblings' callousness and greed, but anger at their fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I was capable of. They saw me as a failure because I'd chosen love over ambition, service over self-advancement, presence over profit. They assumed I was helpless because I'd been selfless, weak because I'd been willing to sacrifice. But they were wrong about so many things. They were wrong about Dad's financial situation, wrong about my capabilities, and wrong about my future prospects. Most importantly, they were wrong to assume that 5 years of devotion to our father had left me with nothing to show for it. The will reading on Tuesday would reveal just how wrong they'd been about everything. Later that afternoon, after David's crew had finished their assault on Dad's house, I found myself alone in rooms that looked like they'd been ransacked by burglars. Boxes of worthless possessions were stacked by the front door, waiting to be hauled away to charity shops or the dump. The furniture that remained looked forlorn and displaced, like props on a stage set that was being struck after the final performance. I walked through the house slowly, remembering the rhythms and routines that had defined my life here. The kitchen where I'd prepared countless meals according to Dad's preferences and dietary restrictions. The living room where we'd watched television together, his hand finding mine during emotional moments in his favorite shows. The bedroom where I'd helped him dress each morning and tucked him in each night, where I'd held vigil during his final hours. In his bedroom, I found one of David's workers had missed a small wooden box that had been tucked behind Dad's alarm clock. Inside were letters Dad had written but never sent, photographs from his childhood, and a business card for Linda Chen, his attorney. Paper clipped to the card was a handwritten note in Dad's careful script. Sarah, everything is taken care of. You'll understand on Tuesday. Trust me. The note was dated just 3 months earlier, during one of Dad's periods of mental clarity. He'd been planning for this moment, preparing for my future in ways I was only beginning to understand. I slipped the note into my pocket and continued my survey of the damage David's crew had inflicted. In the basement, they'd left behind several boxes of papers and documents, apparently judging them too tedious to sort through properly. One box contained Dad's postal service records, commendations for excellent service, and letters from grateful customers whose mail he'd delivered faithfully through all kinds of weather. Another box held financial documents that painted a very different picture from the one David and Rachel had been promoting. Bank statements showing steady deposits that far exceeded Dad's pension and Social Security income. Investment accounts I'd never known existed. Property deeds for addresses I didn't recognize. As I examined these documents more carefully, a pattern began to emerge. Dad hadn't been living paycheck to paycheck during his retirement. He'd been living modestly while his investments and real estate holdings generated substantial income. The man my siblings dismissed as an ordinary postal worker had apparently been anything but ordinary when it came to financial planning and investment strategy. There were rental properties in emerging neighborhoods that had appreciated dramatically over the years. Stock portfolios that had been carefully managed and regularly rebalanced. Savings accounts in multiple banks that together represented a substantial nest egg. Dad had been wealthy. Not just comfortable, but genuinely wealthy. And he'd managed his wealth so discreetly that even his own children had been unaware of its extent. The implications were staggering. If Dad had accumulated this kind of wealth, then David and Rachel's assumptions about his debts and my financial vulnerability were completely unfounded. More importantly, their casual dismissal of his life and legacy as ordinary revealed how little they'd really known about the man they were burying. I spent the rest of the evening going through the financial documents, trying to piece together the full scope of Dad's assets and investments. The more I discovered, the more I realized that Tuesday's will reading was going to be very different from what my siblings were expecting. Dad had kept detailed records of everything, including notes about his investment philosophy and long-term financial goals. In one folder, I found a letter addressed to me, dated just 6 months before his death. My dear Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably feeling lost and uncertain about your future. Your brother and sister have never understood the value of what you've given me these past years. They measure everything in dollars and status, but you've given me something priceless. Your presence, your love, your unwavering dedication to my well-being. I want you to know that I've spent my entire adult life preparing for this moment, not just planning for my own death, but planning for your future. You sacrificed your career, your social life, your chance for marriage and children, all so that I wouldn't have to face my final years alone and afraid. That kind of love deserves to be rewarded, not just with gratitude, but with security and freedom. You'll understand everything at the will reading. Trust Linda Chen. She's helped me structure things exactly as I wanted them. And don't let David and Rachel make you feel guilty about what you'll inherit. You earned every penny through your devotion and sacrifice. Build the life you want, Sarah. You've spent enough years putting other people's needs first. It's time to put yourself first for a change. With all my love and gratitude, Dad. I sat on Dad's basement floor, surrounded by boxes of financial documents, and cried tears that were equal parts grief and relief. Dad had seen what my siblings couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge, that my choice to care for him had been valuable, meaningful, and worthy of recognition. More than that, he'd ensured that my years of sacrifice wouldn't leave me destitute and dependent on David and Rachel's grudging charity. Whatever the specifics of his will, it was clear that he'd made provisions for my future that would give me options my siblings couldn't imagine. The next morning, I woke up in Dad's house for what I suspected might be the last time. David had left several voicemail messages during the night, reminding me about the realtor's appointment and urging me to finalize my decision about Eleanor's companion position. But as I made coffee in Dad's kitchen and watched the sunrise through windows he'd looked through for decades, I felt a sense of calm anticipation rather than anxiety about my uncertain future. In less than 3 days, I would sit in Linda Chen's office and learn exactly what Dad had planned for me. And based on what I'd discovered in those basement boxes, I had a feeling that Tuesday's will reading was going to be very educational for everyone involved. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything seem possible. I dressed carefully for the will reading, choosing a navy blue suit that Dad had always said brought out my eyes, along with the pearl earrings he'd given me for my 40th birthday. As I prepared to leave the house on Maple Street, possibly for the last time as a resident, I felt a strange mixture of grief and anticipation. The law offices of Chen and Associates occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian mansion in downtown Oakwood. Linda Chen had been Dad's attorney for over 15 years, handling everything from his will to his real estate transactions. She was a petite woman in her 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes and the kind of professional demeanor that suggested she'd seen every possible family dynamic play out in her conference room. I arrived 10 minutes early and was shown to a waiting area furnished with leather chairs and mahogany tables that spoke of established success and discretion. Through the tall windows, I could see the tree-lined streets of Oakwood's historic district, where Dad had walked his postal route for nearly 4 decades. David and Rachel arrived together, exactly on time, their faces set in the kind of solemn expressions people wear when they're prepared for disappointment but hoping to be pleasantly surprised. David carried a briefcase, as if he expected to be taking notes or handling complex financial calculations. Rachel wore understated black clothing and minimal jewelry, apparently having decided that morning attire was more appropriate for a will reading than her usual displays of wealth. "Sarah," David nodded curtly as they took seats across from me in the waiting area. "I hope you've given some thought to what we discussed yesterday. Eleanor's position is still available, but she won't wait indefinitely for an answer." Before I could respond, Linda Chen appeared in the doorway of her office, smiling warmly despite the somber nature of our gathering. "Please come in," she said, gesturing toward a conference room dominated by a polished oak table surrounded by high-backed chairs. "I know this is a difficult time for all of you, but your father left very clear instructions about how he wanted his affairs handled." We settled around the conference table, with Linda taking her place at the head while David, Rachel, and I arranged ourselves along the sides. The atmosphere was tense, with unspoken expectations and assumptions about what the next hour would reveal. Linda opened a thick folder and removed several documents, including what appeared to be Dad's will, along with various supporting papers and legal forms. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked at each of us in turn before beginning. "Before we begin with the formal reading," she said, "I want you to know that your father spent considerable time over the past several years planning the distribution of his estate. He was very thoughtful about his decisions and very specific about his intentions." David leaned forward slightly, his business instincts apparently sensing that there might be more complexity to Dad's affairs than he'd anticipated. "Ms. Chen, we should probably establish the scope of the estate first," he said in his professional tone. "My understanding is that Dad lived primarily on his postal pension and Social Security. We're assuming the assets are relatively modest." Linda's expression remained carefully neutral, but I caught a flicker of something that might have been amusement in her eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, your father's estate is somewhat more substantial than you might expect," she replied diplomatically. "But perhaps it would be best if I simply read the will and let the provisions speak for themselves." She lifted the first document and began reading in the formal, measured cadence that legal professionals use for such occasions. "I, Robert James Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. To my children, David Robert Mitchell, Rachel Michelle Mitchell Thompson, and Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, I leave the following provisions. Rachel and David exchanged glances, clearly preparing themselves for the standard division of a modest estate among 3 children. To my son, David Robert Mitchell, Linda continued, I leave the sum of $50,000, along with my tools and workshop equipment, in recognition of his success in building his own construction business and his apparent lack of need for additional financial support. David's face showed surprise at the specific dollar amount, which was more generous than he'd probably expected, but also confusion about the phrasing regarding his lack of need for support. To my daughter, Rachel Michelle Mitchell Thompson, I leave the sum of $50,000, along with my collection of books and family photographs, in recognition of her marriage into a financially secure family and her apparent lack of need for additional financial support. Rachel's mouth tightened slightly at the reference to her marriage as the source of her financial security, but she nodded as if the amount was acceptable if not particularly generous. To my daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, Linda paused and looked directly at me, who sacrificed her career, her personal life, and 5 years of her youth to ensure that I could live my final years with dignity and love. I leave the remainder of my estate. The room went completely silent. David and Rachel sat frozen, their faces reflecting the slow realization that the remainder of the estate might be more significant than they'd imagined. Linda continued reading without missing a beat. This includes, but is not limited to, the family home at 247 Maple Street, Oakwood, Pennsylvania, and all its contents. The rental properties located at 156 Pine Avenue, 892 Oak Street, and 445 Elm Drive. All bank accounts, investment portfolios, and retirement funds, and any other assets not specifically designated elsewhere in this document. David's face had gone pale. Rental properties? He repeated weakly. What rental properties? Linda consulted another document from her folder. Your father owned 4 rental properties in Oakwood and the surrounding communities. He also maintained investment accounts with Fidelity and Vanguard, as well as savings accounts at 3 different banks. Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. What's the total value? Linda looked at me rather than at my siblings as she answered. The estate is valued at approximately $8 million. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap. David actually gripped the edge of the conference table as if he might fall over. Rachel's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish gasping for air. That's impossible, David finally managed to say. Dad was a postal worker. He drove a 15-year-old pickup truck and shopped at discount stores. How could he have accumulated that kind of wealth? Linda's professional composure never wavered. Your father was an extremely disciplined investor and a shrewd judge of real estate opportunities. He began purchasing rental properties in the 1980s when prices were low, and he invested consistently in index funds throughout his working career. He also lived well below his means and reinvested most of his rental income. Rachel found her voice, though it was shaky with shock and something that sounded like desperation. But surely Sarah can't inherit everything. There must be some mistake. Equal distribution among children is normal, isn't it? Ms. Thompson, your father was very clear about his reasoning, Linda replied. He felt that you and your brother had built successful lives independently and no longer needed his financial support. Sarah, however, had sacrificed her own financial security to care for him, and he wanted to ensure that her devotion was properly rewarded. As the full implications of Dad's will began to sink in, I watched my siblings' faces cycle through shock, disbelief, anger, and what I could only describe as panic. The brother and sister who had spent the past week dismissing me as a failure and trying to arrange my future as a live-in servant were suddenly confronting the reality that I was now worth nearly $3 million. David was the first to recover enough to mount an objection. "This isn't right," he said, his voice rising with indignation. Sarah lived in Dad's house rent-free for 5 years. She had no expenses, no responsibilities beyond basic caregiving. We were supporting our own families, building careers, contributing to society. How is that worth less than playing nursemaid? The word nursemaid hung in the air like a slap, revealing David's fundamental inability to understand or respect what I'd given Dad during his final years. Linda's response was swift and decisive. "Mr. Mitchell, your father anticipated that there might be objections to his decision. He asked me to prepare a statement explaining his reasoning, which he wanted read if anyone questioned his choices." She lifted another document and began reading Dad's words, written in his careful handwriting, but transcribed by Linda for legal purposes. "To my children who may question my decisions regarding the distribution of my estate, I have spent the last 5 years watching Sarah sacrifice her career, her social life, and her personal aspirations to ensure that I could age with dignity and love. She has managed my medications, attended my medical appointments, helped me maintain my independence, and provided emotional support during the most challenging period of my life." David started to interrupt, but Linda held up her hand and continued, reading. "During this same period, David visited me an average of once per month for brief conversations focused primarily on his business concerns. Rachel visited even less frequently, and when she did come, she spent most of her time explaining why she couldn't stay long due to her social obligations. Neither of them offered to help with my care, to assist with household maintenance, or to provide emotional support during my decline." Rachel's face was flushed with embarrassment and anger. "That's not fair," she protested. "We had our own lives, our own families to think about. We couldn't just drop everything the way Sarah did." Linda looked at her with the kind of professional patience that suggested she'd heard similar objections many times before. "Ms. Thompson, I'm simply reading your father's statement." He continues, "I want to be clear that I don't blame David and Rachel for pursuing their own lives and priorities. But I also don't believe they should be rewarded equally with Sarah, who made my well-being her priority. Sarah earned this inheritance through 5 years of selfless devotion. She deserves financial security and independence, and I am proud to provide it for her." The room fell silent again as the weight of Dad's words settled over us. These weren't the hasty decisions of a confused elderly man. They were the carefully considered choices of someone who had observed his children's behavior over many years and drawn logical conclusions about who deserved what. David's shock was rapidly transforming into anger. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "Sarah manipulated a sick old man into changing his will. She isolated him from his family and convinced him that we didn't care about him." Before Linda could respond, I spoke for the first time since entering the conference room. "David, I never discussed Dad's will with him. I never asked for anything beyond the privilege of caring for him. And I certainly never tried to turn him against you and Rachel. Your own actions did that." My voice was calm and steady, which seemed to infuriate David even more. "Our own actions?" he repeated incredulously. "We visited regularly. We called to check on him. We offered practical solutions when his care became too complicated for home management. You offered to warehouse him in an assisted living facility so you wouldn't have to deal with the inconvenience of his decline," I replied. "And your regular visits averaged about 30 minutes once a month, usually timed to avoid meal times or any actual caregiving responsibilities." Rachel finally found her voice again, though it was shrill with desperation. "Sarah, you can't seriously intend to keep all of this money. We're your family. Dad would have wanted us to share equally. If Dad had wanted you to share equally, he would have written his will that way," I pointed out. "He was legally competent and had professional counsel. These were his choices, based on his observations of how each of us treated him during his final years." Linda nodded in agreement. "I can attest that Mr. Mitchell was entirely lucid and decisive when he made these provisions. He understood exactly what he was doing and why." David slammed his hand on the conference table, causing everyone to jump. This is insane. Sarah gets millions of dollars for doing what any decent daughter would do, while we get a token $50,000 for being successful and independent. You get $50,000 for being absent and indifferent, I corrected, which, frankly, is more generous than you deserve. The naked hostility in David's eyes was startling. For the first time, I was seeing him without his carefully maintained facade of reasonable authority. Underneath the business suit and professional demeanor was a man consumed by greed and entitlement. "We'll contest this," he said, his voice low and threatening. "No court is going to uphold a will that gives everything to one child while the others get nothing." Linda's expression remained professional, but there was steel in her voice when she responded. "Mr. Mitchell, you're certainly entitled to contest the will if you choose. However, I should inform you that your father anticipated this possibility and took several precautions to ensure his wishes would be upheld." She opened another folder and withdrew a thick stack of documents. "Over the past 2 years, your father documented every interaction he had with each of his children. He kept detailed records of visits, phone calls, offers of assistance, and expressions of concern for his well-being. He also had his mental competency evaluated by 2 independent physicians within 6 months of his death, both of whom certified that he was entirely capable of making legal decisions." David's confidence wavered slightly. "What kind of documentation?" "Dates and times of visits, duration of stays, topics of conversation, and his assessment of each child's level of genuine concern for his welfare," Linda replied matter-of-factly. "He also recorded several conversations in which you and Rachel discussed placing him in institutional care despite his expressed desire to remain in his own home." Rachel's face went white. "He recorded our conversations? Pennsylvania is a one-party consent state for recording conversations," Linda explained. "Your father was legally entitled to record any conversation he participated in, and he did so extensively, particularly during the final year of his life. The implications were staggering. Dad had been systematically documenting his children's behavior, building a legal case to support his decision to leave almost everything to me. It wasn't a sentimental choice based on affection. It was a rational decision based on evidence." David looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You're telling me Dad was spying on his own family?" "I'm telling you that Dad was protecting his right to distribute his assets according to his values and observations," I said. "He wanted to make sure his decisions couldn't be overturned by children who suddenly discovered they cared about his welfare after he was gone." Linda consulted her notes. "Your father was particularly concerned about statements suggesting that Sarah was wasting her life by caring for him, and discussions about the financial benefits of placing him in institutional care. He felt these conversations revealed a fundamental lack of respect for his dignity and Sarah's sacrifice." Rachel was crying now, though whether from grief, shame, or frustration was unclear. "We never meant to hurt him. We were just trying to be practical about a difficult situation." "You were trying to make a difficult situation more convenient for yourselves," I replied. "And now you're upset that Dad recognized the difference between practical concern and genuine love." David made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his expectations. "Sarah, even if you legally inherit everything, surely you can see that this creates an impossible situation for our family. We'll never be able to have a normal relationship if there's this kind of financial disparity between us." It was a masterful manipulation, framing his greed as concern for family harmony. But I'd spent 5 years watching David's version of family relationships, and I knew exactly how much he valued harmony when it conflicted with his own interests. "David, we haven't had a normal family relationship in years," I said. "You and Rachel made it clear that you considered me a failure and a burden. You tried to arrange my future without consulting me, assuming I was too incompetent to make my own decisions. This inheritance doesn't change our relationship. It just reveals what our relationship has always been." Linda cleared her throat diplomatically. "If there are no further questions about the will's provisions, I do need to discuss some practical matters regarding the transfer of assets." For the next 30 minutes, she walked me through the process of taking control of Dad's estate. Bank accounts, investment portfolios, rental properties, and various other assets would be transferred to my name over the next several weeks. The house on Maple Street was already mine, along with everything in it. David and Rachel sat in stunned silence throughout this discussion, apparently still processing the magnitude of their miscalculation. They'd spent years dismissing Dad as ordinary, and me as a failure, never imagining that the quiet postal worker had accumulated more wealth than both of their households combined. When the meeting finally ended, we walked out of Linda Chen's office into a world that looked exactly the same, but felt completely different. I was no longer the spinster sister who needed to be managed and directed. I was an independently wealthy woman with more financial freedom than either of my siblings. David and Rachel lingered on the sidewalk outside the law office, clearly reluctant to separate before they'd figured out how to respond to this dramatic reversal of fortune. "Sarah, we need to talk about this," David said, his tone attempting to recapture some of his former authority. "This situation isn't sustainable. The family dynamics, the financial imbalance, the potential for resentment and conflict. We need to find a way to make this work for everyone." But I was no longer interested in David's version of making things work, which invariably involved other people accommodating his preferences and priorities. "David, I'm going home," I said, "to my house, to start planning my future, a future that I'll design according to my own values and priorities." Rachel stepped forward, her tear-streaked face a mixture of desperation and calculation. "Sarah, please don't let money destroy our family. Dad wouldn't have wanted this inheritance to drive us apart." "Dad gave me this inheritance because we were already apart," I replied. "Because you and David had already made it clear that you didn't value my choices or respect my contributions to his care. This money doesn't change our relationship. It just gives me the freedom to stop pretending we have one." I walked away from them then, leaving them standing on the sidewalk outside the law office, probably already planning their next attempt to manipulate or guilt me into sharing what Dad had specifically intended for me alone. The drive back to Maple Street gave me time to process the magnitude of what had just happened. I was wealthy. Not just comfortable, but genuinely wealthy. Wealthy enough to live anywhere I wanted, to pursue any interests that appealed to me, to travel, to volunteer, to start a business, to do anything that captured my imagination. More importantly, I was free. Free from David and Rachel's condescension and manipulation. Free from their attempts to manage my future according to their convenience. Free from the financial vulnerability that had made their opinions seem important. The house on Maple Street looked different when I pulled into the driveway. It was still the same modest colonial where I'd spent 5 years caring for Dad, but now it was unquestionably mine. No one could force me to sell it, move out of it, or modify it to suit their preferences. It was my sanctuary, my base of operations, my launching pad for whatever came next. I spent the rest of that afternoon walking through the house, seeing it with new eyes. The furniture that David and Rachel had dismissed as worthless was now mine to keep, donate, or replace according to my own tastes. The photographs and mementos they'd wanted to throw away were now preserved as reminders of Dad's love and my own growth during our years together. The evening brought phone calls that I declined to answer. David called 6 times, Rachel called 4 times, and I could see several text messages accumulating on my phone, but I wasn't ready to deal with their attempts to renegotiate the will's provisions or manipulate me into sharing what Dad had specifically intended for me. Instead, I made myself dinner using Dad's favorite recipes, ate at the kitchen table, where we'd shared thousands of meals and planned my new life with the kind of careful attention Dad had taught me to bring to important decisions. Over the next several days, the calls and messages from David and Rachel escalated in frequency and desperation. David's messages focused on practical concerns about family unity and the importance of sharing good fortune. Rachel's were more emotional, alternating between guilt trips about family loyalty and barely veiled threats about the consequences of my selfishness. But the most revealing communications came in the form of voicemails that exposed their true feelings about the situation. "Sarah, this is ridiculous." David's voice was tight with frustration on one message. "You can't seriously think you deserve millions of dollars for being a babysitter. We're talking about contesting this will, and when we do, all the ugly details about Dad's mental state are going to come out. Do you really want to put the family through that kind of public scrutiny?" Rachel's messages were even more direct in their hostility. "Sarah, I don't know who you think you are now, but money doesn't change the fact that you're still a 45-year-old spinster with no real accomplishments. You can't buy respect or class or the things that actually matter in life. Don't let this windfall go to your head." The messages revealed what I'd suspected all along. David and Rachel's concern wasn't about family harmony or fairness. They were angry that someone they'd always considered their inferior had suddenly become their financial superior. They couldn't tolerate the reversal of the power dynamic that had defined our relationships for decades. But their attempts at intimidation and manipulation no longer had any effect on me. For the first time in my adult life, I had the financial independence to ignore their opinions and pursue my own interests without needing their approval or support. 3 weeks after the will reading, I received a formal letter from David's attorney announcing their intention to contest Dad's will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished mental capacity. The letter was full of legal threats and accusations, suggesting that I had manipulated Dad into changing his will by isolating him from his other children and poisoning his mind against them. I forwarded the letter to Linda Chen, who called me the same day with what sounded like amusement in her voice. "Sarah, I've been practicing estate law for 25 years, and I've never seen a more thoroughly documented will," she said. "Your father created an ironclad legal record of his decision-making process. If your siblings want to contest this in court, they're welcome to try, but they're going to lose spectacularly." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you live your life," Linda replied. "You use the freedom your father gave you to build whatever future makes you happy, and you let your siblings waste their own money on legal fees if they want to pursue a case they can't win." That afternoon, I drove through Oakwood's neighborhoods, looking at the rental properties Dad had left me. They were well-maintained buildings in good locations, generating steady income from reliable tenants. Dad had chosen his investments as carefully as he'd chosen everything else in his life, with an eye toward long-term stability rather than short-term profits. As I stood outside the first property, a small apartment building near the college, I realized that Dad had given me more than money. He'd given me a lesson in patience, planning, and the power of quiet persistence. Just as he'd built his wealth, gradually and discreetly over decades, I could use my inheritance to build whatever life I chose for myself. 6 months later, I was settled into a routine that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. I'd kept the house on Maple Street but renovated it extensively, creating a home that honored Dad's memory while reflecting my own tastes and interests. I'd started volunteering at the library again, not because I needed the income, but because I missed the work and the community connection it provided. I'd also begun traveling, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt I could afford. Paris in the spring, Italy in the summer, a photography tour of New Zealand in the fall. Each trip was a reminder that I was no longer bound by other people's limitations or expectations. David and Rachel's legal challenge had been dismissed within 4 months, exactly as Linda had predicted. The judge had been particularly scathing in his assessment of their case, noting that the evidence strongly supported Dad's mental competency and his rational reasons for distributing his estate as he had. The legal defeat seemed to break something, in their determination to maintain contact with me. The phone calls stopped, the guilt trip messages ended, and we settled into a pattern of polite distance that suited everyone involved. I ran into Rachel at the grocery store one afternoon, and the encounter revealed how much our dynamic had changed. Instead of the condescending superiority she'd always shown toward me, there was now a careful deference in her manner, as if she was unsure how to interact with someone she could no longer control or dismiss. "Sarah, you look wonderful," she said, her smile brittle but genuine. "The traveling must agree with you." "It does," I replied. Dad always wanted to travel but never felt he could afford it. I'm fulfilling some of his dreams along with my own. The mention of Dad created an awkward pause. Rachel had never acknowledged her role in his final years or expressed any regret about her treatment of him or me. "Well, I'm glad you're happy," she said finally. "I hope everything works out well for you." It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get from Rachel, and I found that I no longer needed more than that. The anger and hurt that had consumed me during Dad's final months had been replaced by something closer to indifference. Rachel's opinions about my life no longer mattered because I no longer needed anything from her. As I drove home that afternoon, I reflected on how completely my world had changed since that terrible week following Dad's funeral. The sister who had called me a failure was now treating me with careful respect. The brother who had tried to ship me off to work as a live-in servant was now avoiding me entirely. The family members who had dismissed Dad as ordinary had learned that his quiet life had produced extraordinary results. But the most important change was in how I saw myself. I was no longer the spinster sister who needed to be managed and directed. I was no longer the family caregiver whose sacrifices were taken for granted. I was no longer dependent on other people's approval or support for my sense of worth and direction. I was Sarah Mitchell, a woman who had chosen love over convenience, service over self-advancement, and presence over profit. And instead of being punished for those choices, I had been rewarded with the freedom to make whatever choices came next. Dad had been right about so many things. Love was showing up. Devotion was valuable. Kindness was worth more than status or wealth. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the universe finds a way to ensure that good choices lead to good outcomes. That evening, I sat on the front porch of the house on Maple Street, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The neighborhood was quiet except for the sound of children playing in nearby yards and the distant hum of traffic. On the main road where Dad had walked his postal route for nearly 4 decades, I thought about the 5 years I'd spent caring for him, the sacrifices that had seemed so costly at the time, the isolation and exhaustion and uncertainty about my future. All of it had led to this moment, this freedom, this opportunity to build a life based on my own values and dreams rather than other people's expectations. Dad had given me more than an inheritance. He'd given me validation that my choices had been right, that love and service and presence were valuable even when they weren't appreciated by everyone around me. He'd given me the financial independence to live according to my own principles, without needing anyone else's approval or support. Most importantly, he'd given me the confidence to trust my own judgment about what mattered in life. I'd spent 45 years seeking validation from people who measured worth in terms of income and status and social position, but Dad had shown me that there were other ways to measure a life's value, other definitions of success that had nothing to do with external achievements. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I made myself a promise. I would use this gift, this freedom, this second chance, to build a life that honored both Dad's memory and my own dreams. I would travel and learn and explore and contribute to causes that mattered to me. I would be generous with my time and resources, but I would never again sacrifice my own well-being for people who didn't value the sacrifice. I would live boldly, love deeply, and trust that the same instincts that had led me to care for Dad would guide me toward whatever came next. The house on Maple Street settled into evening quietness around me, and I felt the deep contentment that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're meant to be doing, with exactly the resources you need to build whatever future calls to you. Dad had kept his promise. Everything was taken care of. I understood now, completely and finally, what he'd meant by that simple phrase. He hadn't just ensured my financial security, he'd given me the freedom to discover who I was when I wasn't defined by other people's needs and expectations. The spinster sister was gone. The family failure was gone. The woman who had emerged from 5 years of caregiving and 1 afternoon of legal revelations was someone new, someone stronger, someone ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. 1 year after the will reading that changed everything, I found myself standing in the kitchen of my renovated home on Maple Street, preparing breakfast for an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor who had witnessed Dad's final years, had called the previous evening to ask if she could stop by with something that belonged to me. The morning sunlight streamed through new windows I'd installed during the renovation, casting warm patterns across granite countertops that had replaced Dad's worn Formica surfaces. The house was still recognizably the same structure where I'd cared for him, but every room now reflected my own taste and vision for comfortable living. Mrs. Henderson arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying a small wooden box that I recognized immediately. It was the keepsake container Dad had kept on his bedroom dresser, the one David's cleanup crew had somehow overlooked during their hasty clearing of his belongings. "I found this in my garden shed yesterday," she explained, settling carefully into one of my new kitchen chairs. "Your father gave it to me about 6 months before he passed, along with strict instructions that I should only give it to you after his will had been read and settled. He said there were things inside that you'd need when you were ready to build your new life." My hands trembled slightly as I accepted the box. Dad had planned even this detail, ensuring that his final gift to me would arrive precisely when I was prepared to receive it. Inside, I found a collection of items that told the story of a man far more complex and thoughtful than my siblings had ever realized. There were investment statements dating back 30 years, showing how Dad had systematically purchased stocks and real estate with the patience of someone who understood that wealth building was a marathon rather than a sprint. There were handwritten notes documenting his philosophy of financial independence, his belief that money should provide security and freedom rather than status or luxury. Most surprisingly, there were letters addressed to me that he'd written during my years of caregiving but never delivered. In them, he expressed his gratitude for my presence, his concern about my sacrifices, and his determination to ensure that my devotion would be rewarded with the independence to pursue my own dreams. One letter, dated just 3 months before his death, contained a revelation that explained so much about his careful planning. "My dearest Sarah, I know you think I chose you to inherit my estate because you were the only one who stayed to care for me. That's partly true, but it's not the whole story. The truth is, I've been watching all 3 of my children your entire lives, and you're the only one who consistently chose love over convenience, service over self-interest, compassion over calculation." David and Rachel learned to measure success in dollars and status symbols. They became the kind of people who see relationships as transactions and family obligations as inconveniences to be managed efficiently. But you learned something different. You learned that showing up matters more than showing off, that presence is more valuable than presence, that true wealth comes from the depth of your connections rather than the size of your bank account. I'm giving you my financial wealth because I know you'll use it wisely, but more importantly, I'm giving it to you because you already understand what real wealth looks like. You've been rich in the things that matter most your entire adult life. Now you'll have the freedom to share that richness with the world. Reading Dad's words in the quiet of my transformed kitchen, I finally understood the full scope of what he'd given me. The money was significant, life-changing, liberating. But the real inheritance was his validation that my choices had been right, That a life built on love and service and genuine connection was valuable even when it wasn't appreciated by everyone around me. Mrs. Henderson watched me read with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully completed an important mission. At 87, she'd known Dad longer than anyone else in his life, and she'd observed our family dynamics with the keen insight that comes from decades of watching human nature play out in a small community. "Your father was very proud of you," she said as I carefully folded the letters. "He used to tell me that you were the proof that he'd done something right as a parent. He said David and Rachel were successful according to the world's standards, but you were successful according to his standards." We spent the next hour talking about Dad's legacy and my plans for the future. Mrs. Henderson shared stories about his kindness toward neighbors, his quiet generosity to community members who were struggling, his reputation as someone who could be counted on to help without being asked twice. "He would have loved seeing what you've done with the house," she observed, looking around at the bright, welcoming space I'd created. "It feels like him, but it feels like you too. Familiar, but fresh." After Mrs. Henderson left, I spent the rest of the morning exploring the final contents of Dad's keepsake box. There were photographs I'd never seen before, including pictures of him volunteering at the food bank, coaching Little League baseball, and helping elderly neighbors with yard work. These images revealed a man who had been actively engaged in his community in ways that David and Rachel had never known or acknowledged. There was also a sealed envelope marked for Sarah's future adventures, containing detailed information about travel destinations Dad had always wanted to visit. He'd researched hotels, restaurants, historical sites, and cultural experiences in dozens of countries, creating a personalized guidebook for the travels he hoped I would someday be able to afford. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, of a very different sort. Rachel appeared at my front door carrying a beautifully wrapped gift and wearing the kind of carefully composed expression that suggested she'd rehearsed this encounter multiple times. "Sarah, I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty I'd never heard before. "I brought you something, and I was hoping we could talk." I invited her in, curious about what had motivated this visit after months of minimal contact. The living room where we settled had been completely transformed since her last visit, with new furniture, fresh paint, and artwork I'd collected during my travels. The space reflected my own taste and interests, rather than Dad's more modest preferences, though I'd preserved several meaningful pieces that connected me to our shared years. Rachel's gift was a framed photograph of our family from my college graduation, one of the few pictures where all four of us looked genuinely happy together. It was a thoughtful choice, acknowledging our shared history while recognizing the reality of our current situation. "I've been thinking a lot about the past year," she said, accepting the cup of tea I offered. "About Dad's death, the will reading, everything that happened afterward. I owe you an apology, Sarah. Several apologies, actually." The admission surprised me. Rachel had always been someone who deflected responsibility and justified her choices rather than acknowledging mistakes or expressing regret. "I was wrong about so many things," she continued. "Wrong about Dad's financial situation, wrong about your motivations for caring for him, wrong about your capabilities and prospects. But mostly, I was wrong about what really matters in life." She paused, looking around the renovated room with what appeared to be genuine admiration. "This house, your travels, the independence you've built for yourself, it all came from the 5 years you spent putting Dad's needs before your own ambitions. At the time, I thought you were making a terrible mistake, sacrificing your future for someone whose best years were behind him." I sipped my tea and waited for her to continue, sensing that this conversation had been building toward this moment for months. "But now I see that you were investing in something more valuable than a career or a social position," Rachel said. "You were investing in a relationship, in your own character, in the kind of person you wanted to be when faced with difficult choices. And that investment paid dividends in ways that I never could have imagined. The acknowledgement meant more to me than I'd expected. For so long, I'd carried the weight of their disapproval and dismissal, wondering if perhaps they were right about my choices being misguided or wasteful. "I'm not saying I could have made the same choice," Rachel continued honestly. "I'm not. Sure, I have that kind of selflessness or patience, but I'm saying that I was wrong to judge your choice as inferior to mine." We talked for nearly 2 hours, the longest genuine conversation Rachel and I had shared in years. She told me about the difficulties in her marriage that she'd hidden behind a facade of social success, about her children's struggles with anxiety and depression, about her growing realization that the life she'd built was impressive from the outside but emotionally hollow. "Michael's family has money, but they don't have love," she said quietly. "They have status and connections and beautiful homes, but they don't have the kind of relationship you had with Dad. They don't have memories of someone choosing to be present during the hard times." When she left that afternoon, something had shifted between us. We weren't going to be close sisters who shared everything, but we were no longer adversaries competing for validation or resources. We were two middle-aged women who had chosen different paths and were learning to respect each other's choices, even when we couldn't fully understand them. David's reconciliation took longer and followed a more complicated route. 6 months after Rachel's visit, I received a letter from his attorney informing me that his construction company was facing serious financial difficulties due to a combination of poor investment decisions and a downturn in the local building market. The letter wasn't asking for a loan directly, but it made clear that David was in danger of losing his business and possibly his home. The brother who had dismissed Dad's modest lifestyle was discovering that his own flashier version of success was built on shakier foundations. I didn't respond to the attorney's letter, but I did some research into David's situation. The details revealed a pattern of overextension and overconfidence that had left him vulnerable when market conditions changed. He'd borrowed heavily to expand his operations, assuming that growth would continue indefinitely, and now he was trapped by debt payments he couldn't meet. 3 weeks later, David himself called me for the first time since the failed will contest. His voice was different, lacking the aggressive confidence that had always characterized our interactions. "Sarah, I know we haven't been on good terms," he said, the words coming slowly as if they were difficult to speak. "And I know I have no right to ask you for anything after the way I treated you and Dad, but I'm in trouble, and I don't know where else to turn." The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. David was forced to acknowledge the reality of his situation, to admit that his business acumen hadn't been as solid as he'd believed, to accept that the sister he'd dismissed as a failure was now in a position to help or refuse help as she chose. "I'm not asking for a handout," he said, though we both knew that's exactly what he was asking for. "I'm asking for a business loan, something with fair terms and a realistic repayment schedule. I know you don't owe me anything, but I'm hoping you might consider it for the sake of family." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of us. The brother who had tried to arrange my future as a live-in servant was now asking for financial assistance from the inheritance he'd tried to contest. The man who had questioned whether I deserved Dad's wealth was now hoping to benefit from it himself. I told David I'd consider his request and get back to him within a week. Then I spent several days thinking carefully about what Dad would have wanted me to do in this situation. In the end, I decided to help David, but on terms that would ensure he learned from his mistakes, rather than simply being rescued from their consequences. I offered him a loan at market interest rates, with a repayment schedule that would require him to restructure his business operations more conservatively. More importantly, I required him to acknowledge publicly that Dad's inheritance had been distributed fairly and according to clear criteria. David had to withdraw his lingering complaints about the will and admit that his financial difficulties were the result of his own poor decisions, rather than any unfairness in Dad's estate planning. The process of negotiating these terms gave David and me opportunities to discuss our relationship and our different perspectives on Dad's final years. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a foundation for a more honest and respectful dynamic going forward. David never became as reflective or apologetic as Rachel had been, but he did acknowledge that his dismissal of my caregiving had been unfair and short-sighted. He also admitted that his assumptions about Dad's financial situation had been based on prejudice rather than evidence. "I never took the time to really understand what Dad had accomplished," he said during one of our loan negotiation meetings. "I saw the old truck and the modest lifestyle and assumed he was barely getting by. I never considered that he might be choosing to live simply while building wealth systematically." The loan arrangement worked out well for both of us. David's payments provided me with additional investment income, and the structured repayment schedule forced him to operate his business more conservatively and sustainably. More importantly, the process established a new dynamic between us based on mutual respect rather than sibling rivalry or assumed superiority. 2 years after Dad's death, I found myself in a position I could never have imagined during those difficult final months of his life. I was financially independent, emotionally secure, and free to pursue whatever interests and adventures appealed to me. I'd completed extensive travels through Europe and Asia, fulfilling many of the destination dreams Dad had researched, but never been able to afford. I'd volunteered with literacy programs in developing countries, combining my library background with my desire to contribute meaningfully to causes I cared about. I'd also begun a scholarship program for students who were serving as primary caregivers for family members, understanding from my own experience how difficult it could be to pursue education or career advancement while providing intensive care for loved ones. The scholarship program became my way of honoring Dad's memory while helping other people avoid the financial penalties that often accompany choosing family obligations over personal advancement. Recipients received funding for tuition, books, and living expenses, along with mentorship and career guidance to help them transition successfully once their caregiving responsibilities ended. The program's first recipient was a young woman named Maria, who had been caring for her grandmother while working toward a nursing degree. Her thank you letter reminded me powerfully of my own journey. Before receiving this scholarship, I felt like I was being punished for choosing to care for my grandmother instead of focusing only on my studies. People kept telling me I was sacrificing my future, that I should put Abuela in a facility so I could concentrate on becoming successful. But your scholarship showed me that someone understood the value of what I was doing, that caring for family wasn't a distraction from building a meaningful life, but an essential part of it. Reading Maria's words, I realized that Dad's final gift to me had multiplied far beyond anything he could have imagined. His inheritance hadn't just given me financial freedom. It had given me the resources to validate and support other people who were making the same difficult choices I had made. 5 years after Dad's death, I stood in the cemetery at Riverside where he was buried, placing fresh flowers on his grave and reflecting on everything that had changed since that terrible week following his funeral. The woman who had been dismissed as a failure was now actively improving other people's lives through her scholarship program. The daughter who had been told she was throwing her life away was now living more fully and purposefully than she ever had before. The sister who had been pitied for her lack of traditional achievements was now respected by David and Rachel for her wisdom and generosity. But the most important change was internal. I no longer needed other people's approval to feel valuable or worthwhile. I no longer measured my success against external standards that had never reflected my own values and priorities. Dad had been right about so many things. Love was showing up day after day, especially when it was difficult or inconvenient. Wealth wasn't about what you owned, but about what you could do for yourself and others. Success wasn't about impressing other people, but about living according to your own principles and finding peace with your choices. As I prepared to leave the cemetery that afternoon, I noticed an elderly man visiting a nearby grave, moving slowly and appearing somewhat unsteady on his feet. Without thinking, I approached him and offered assistance, helping him place flowers and navigate the uneven ground safely. "Thank you, dear," he said as I walked him back to his car. My daughter keeps telling me I should hire someone to help with these visits, but this is something I need to do myself. My wife always loved fresh flowers, and I promised her I'd bring them every week as long as I was able. His words reminded me that caregiving and devotion take many forms, that the choice to prioritize love over convenience is one that people make at every stage of life and in countless different circumstances. Driving home to Maple Street that evening, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you found your place in the world and your purpose in life. Dad's inheritance had given me financial security, but his example had given me something far more valuable: the confidence to trust my own judgment about what mattered most. The house on Maple Street welcomed me home with warm light spilling from windows I'd cleaned myself, rooms I'd decorated according to my own taste, spaces that reflected both my past and my future. It was a sanctuary I'd earned through 5 years of devotion and a launching pad for whatever adventures lay ahead. That night, I sat at my kitchen table reading applications for the next round of caregiving scholarships, each one representing someone who was choosing love over convenience, family obligation over personal advancement, presence over profit. Their stories reminded me that Dad's legacy was continuing to grow and multiply, touching lives he'd never meet, but whose struggles he would have understood completely. The phone rang as I was finishing my review of the applications. It was Rachel, calling to share news about her daughter's acceptance to college and to ask my advice about balancing family support with encouraging independence. "I keep thinking about the choices you made with Dad," she said. "How you managed to be supportive without being controlling, present without being overwhelming. I want to be that kind of mother, but I'm not sure I know how." The conversation that followed was warm and genuine. Two sisters sharing their perspectives on love and sacrifice and the complicated dynamics of family relationships. It was the kind of conversation I'd always hoped we might have, but had never quite been able to achieve before. After hanging up, I returned to the scholarship applications with renewed appreciation for the ripple effects of Dad's final gift. His decision to reward my caregiving hadn't just changed my life. It had changed how my siblings thought about family obligations, how I approached my own future, and how dozens of scholarship recipients would navigate their own caregiving journeys. The woman who had been called worthless at her father's funeral had become the center of an expanding circle of support and understanding for people who chose love over convenience. The inheritance that had shocked everyone at the will reading had become the foundation for a legacy of compassion and practical assistance that would outlast any individual bank account or real estate portfolio. As I prepared for bed that night in the house where Dad had lived his final years with dignity and love, I felt the deep peace that comes from knowing you've honored someone's memory in the most meaningful way possible, by using their gifts to make the world a little bit kinder, a little bit more understanding, a little bit more supportive of the people who choose service over self-interest. Dad had been gone for 5 years, but his influence continued to grow through every scholarship awarded, every caregiver supported, every family strengthened by the knowledge that their sacrifices were valuable and worthy of recognition. Twice, family that had called me worthless had learned to see worth in ways they'd never considered before. And the father whose love had sustained me through the darkest moments of grief and uncertainty had given me not just financial independence, but the resources to honor his values in ways that would continue long after I was gone. Standing at my bedroom window, looking out at the neighborhood where Dad had walked his postal route for decades, I made a silent promise to continue building on the foundation he'd given me. The scholarship program would grow, the support for caregivers would expand, and the message that love and service were valuable would reach as many people as possible. The worthless daughter had become a woman of true worth, not because of the money she'd inherited, but because of the way she'd chosen to use it. And in that transformation, Dad's final gift had achieved exactly what he'd hoped: the chance for his daughter to build a life that honored both his memory and her own deepest values. Up next, You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.